Privately, officials aren't calling it a mishap. They're calling it a slaughter, a catastrophic intelligence breakdown stained with political motives. And here's the devastating truth. This wasn't simply a chaotic skirmish that went sideways. It was the opening move of a broader U.S. military initiative announced by former President Donald Trump to launch an outright war against Mexican cartels. Not a symbolic gesture, not political posturing, war. A new chapter in U.S.-Mexico relations, where clandestine missions, erased boundaries, and rising death tolls are swiftly replacing diplomacy and traditional drug policy. The most jarring revelation at the core of this entire investigation is the betrayal itself. The way those soldiers were abandoned in hostile cartel territory, left for dead by their own government. This is no conspiracy theory. This isn't some internet fantasy spun for clicks. It's a thoroughly documented, cross-verified account of a genuine American tragedy, buried by officials before the fallen were even laid to rest. The foundation for this doomed mission wasn't hidden in secrecy. It was set out openly. During several public speeches, former President Trump vowed to unleash a full-scale war on the cartels, officially designating them as foreign terrorist organizations and expanding the military's legal reach to hit targets beyond standard rules of engagement. His reasoning? Cartels, he argued, are killing more Americans with fentanyl than ISIS ever managed with bombs. But before we proceed, please like and subscribe to our channel to grow our rising community. Each year, the U.S. loses hundreds of thousands of people, 300,000 lives gone. Everywhere you turn, someone says they lost a son, a daughter, a loved one, most often to fentanyl, but always to drugs. Families are being shattered, he declared, and the government would put an end to it. That promise, he claimed, wasn't just campaign talk. By the time his administration geared up for another election run, concrete plans were already underway to send American special forces into action, working alongside Mexican intelligence to strike cartel operations directly. The idea, on paper, was pinpoint raids, fast, precise, in-and-out strikes aimed at crippling trafficking routes. But what wasn't fully considered, or perhaps willfully ignored, was the harsh reality waiting on the ground. The cartels are not just loose groups of criminals. They operate like paramilitary forces, heavily armed, deeply entrenched, and propped up by corruption at nearly every level of Mexican governance. Their grip on regions rivals what Hamas holds in Gaza or what the Taliban wielded in Afghanistan. So when American boots crossed into their domain, chaos exploded. A mission that was supposed to be a surgical strike in northern Tamaulipas unraveled into catastrophe. A Pentagon memo, later leaked and assessed by independent analysts, described it as a total breakdown of operational command. Reports detail U.S. troops being encircled, stripped of their weapons, and executed by cartel fighters disguised as civilians. Executed, let that register. This wasn't a chaotic firefight gone wrong. It was intentional. It was a message. And, worst of all, evidence suggests the U.S. government anticipated it. Weeks before the mission, whistleblowers inside the Defense Intelligence Agency flagged concerns about a major counterintelligence breach. The cartels had been tipped off, landing points were compromised, radio channels were jammed, and despite all the warnings, the operation went ahead. Why? The answer lies in the political theater surrounding it. Just days earlier, Trump had gone on national television vowing justice for 12-year-old Jocelyn Nungari, a Texas child kidnapped and murdered by gang members from Venezuela tied to the cartel Tren de Aragua. She was abducted, bound, brutalized for hours beneath a bridge, and killed in cold blood. Arrested for the crime were 2 Venezuelan migrants in the U.S. illegally. That very night, Trump signed an executive order classifying Tren de Aragua, MS-13, and several Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist groups. This designation cleared the way for drone strikes, surveillance missions, and special operations without Mexico's agreement, And the timing was no accident. It was a calculated move to rally his base, a deliberate gamble to showcase strength on border security and immigration just ahead of a critical primary. But the cost was American lives. Survivors say that's what gnaws at them the most, the betrayal. It wasn't only that their comrades were gunned down. It wasn't just that the U.S. abandoned them in hostile territory, swarming with fighters in body armor and machine guns. It was that someone high up in the chain of command knew. They knew the intel had been exposed. They knew the cartels were lying in wait. They knew the soldiers were walking into an ambush. And still, they let it happen. This is not speculation. This isn't a wild conspiracy. It's sworn testimony from Sergeant Caleb Rourke, one of only 3 men who survived Operation Black Sand, a mission so secret it was hidden even from internal Pentagon briefings. Rourke was never meant to talk. He was bound by non-disclosure agreements, threatened with dishonorable discharge, and warned that speaking out could be treated as treason. Yet he spoke. In a private deposition to congressional investigators, later leaked to the press, his account may go down as one of the most damning whistleblower revelations since the Pat Tillman scandal. "We were told we'd be hitting a cartel weapons transfer," Rourke explained. "What we actually faced was a fortified battalion entrenched with .50 caliber machine guns, thermal scopes, and radio interception tools. That's not drug runners. That's a military-style insurgency. Think about that. This wasn't just a cartel. It was a militia, a force with coordinated ambush positions, satellite communication, and, according to Rourke, precise knowledge of every American maneuver. He described it as less like a tactical mistake and more like walking into a funeral someone else had already arranged for you. The mission, Operation Black Sand, was intended as a fast assault on a fentanyl hub operated by the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. A DEA report later revealed this single CJNG cell was linked to nearly 40% of fentanyl entering Texas. But here's where things began to unravel. The mission was never coordinated with Mexican officials, not even secretly. Sources within Mexico's defense ministry told El Universal they were given no warning, no request for cooperation. In fact, they only learned U.S. troops had crossed into Tamaulipas after the ambush itself. That's a breach of international law, raising the uncomfortable question, who signed off on it? In the months leading up to the bloodshed, Trump had repeatedly insisted the U.S. must go beyond disrupting cartels. It must wage war. His words were not figurative. Through emergency national security directives, the U.S. military gained authority to pursue extraterritorial missions against designated terror groups. With Tren de Aragua, MS-13, and CJNG labeled as such, the justification was already in place. But international law scholars argue such actions conducted without host nation consent defy the UN Charter, amounting to acts of war. So why risk it? According to a former National Security Council staffer speaking anonymously to The Atlantic, it wasn't about legality. It was about optics. It was about entering the next debate with a dramatic victory to tout. The administration wanted its bin Laden moment. They thought they could stage one quickly. Instead, they walked straight into a slaughter. And what followed was even darker. A leaked after-action report reviewed by ProPublica revealed that once the ambush began, U.S. forces immediately called for air support. Gunfire erupted just after 3:40 a.m. Drone footage showed multiple cartel vehicles with mounted weapons advancing. One operator relayed, "Sustained fire from superior numbers, requesting immediate air." Yet no backup ever came. Why? Because the Black Hawk helicopters assigned to the mission had been grounded the day before over budget-related mechanical delays. That's right. 14 Americans died because the Pentagon hadn't allocated funds to repair 2 helicopters, even as Congress had just approved $95 billion in foreign aid abroad. Rourke's testimony grows raw here. He broke down recalling the scene. "I watched two of my closest friends cut down. I pulled one into cover. He was still alive. I tried to stop the bleeding, but it was everywhere. Then the drone feed cut out. That's when I knew they abandoned us." And here's the brutal detail. The footage still exists. Multiple NSA insiders confirm live surveillance footage of the massacre is archived under a high-level clearance protocol known as Project Indigo. But lawmakers requesting access were told it was irrelevant to ongoing investigations. What's being hidden? What don't they want Americans to see? Meanwhile, cartel fighters themselves uploaded their own footage, gruesome, unedited clips showing fallen soldiers, destroyed equipment, mocking messages. In one video, a masked gunman holds up the ID of a U.S. Marine and sneers in Spanish, "Send more. We'll bury them the same way." Yet despite these escalating taunts, the White House has refused to acknowledge the operation ever took place. When pressed by CNN's Jake Tapper, a Pentagon spokesperson dodged, "We don't comment on ongoing special operations." But this wasn't ongoing. It was over. And American men were dead. Their families never got the truth. Death notices cited combat fatalities, with no details of when, where, or how they fell. One widow demanded answers, only to be told by a Pentagon aide that the mission was above her clearance. Her husband died in service of his country, and the government wouldn't even say where his body had been found. Public outrage is growing. Protests erupt nationwide. In Houston, crowds gathered outside a funeral chanting, "No more shadow wars." Through tears, the widow of Staff Sergeant Antonio Delgado said, "We were told he was defending America, but America didn't defend him." Still, ICE Director Tom Homan has doubled down, insisting escalation is necessary to reclaim sovereignty. Critics argue the opposite, that the entire strategy is broken. Instead of easing the humanitarian crisis or curbing drugs, these missions only open new fronts in endless wars. Wars with no rules, no accountability, and no path to victory. Leaked communications obtained by The Intercept reveal U.S. officials are already planning larger raids with expanded engagement protocols, despite the massacre. The mindset is clear. Don't retreat. Escalate, because to back down would look like defeat. But the truth? The defeat already happened. We've lost soldiers, we've lost allies, we've lost credibility. Above all, we've lost trust. Trust in leadership, trust in command, trust in the belief that America never abandons its own. Among insiders, though, the operation had another name, not Black Sand, not containment. It was called Shadow Ridge, and that title said it all, a mission born in shadows, hidden beneath the ridge of deniability, disposable, dangerous, and ultimately deadly. But the ambush at Tamaulipas wasn't the beginning. It was the climax of a covert conflict, years in the making. And at its core wasn't only soldiers or commanders, it was a network of defense contractors, political donors, and intelligence operatives who stood to gain from one thing: escalation. This was never just about border security. It was about profit. Because war, whether declared or covert, is lucrative. To see how deep it runs, we have to rewind to the launch of a controversial initiative called the Northern Stabilization Corridor Command. You haven't heard of it? That's intentional. It wasn't a traditional command structure. It was an alliance of JSOC operatives, CIA Special Activities Center agents, and private contractors from a company called Sable North, headquartered in Virginia. Their mission: secure trafficking routes between Nuevo Laredo and Monterrey. Translation: seize cartel-dominated trade corridors at any cost. According to leaked procurement records obtained by The Intercept, Sable North was paid $118 million in emergency defense contracts between 2023 and 2025. The most startling detail? The authorization came directly from Senator Roger Delancey's office. a senior member of the Armed Services Committee. Why would a senator personally approve black budget payouts to an overseas contractor? Because, as it turns out, his brother was an investor in a Mexican energy conglomerate, negotiating with U.S. firms for a cross-border pipeline through cartel-controlled territory. This wasn't about fentanyl. It was about land, about profit, and American soldiers were the collateral. Months before Black Sand, Sable North teams were already embedded in Mexican towns, advising paramilitary police known as Fuerza Estatal. They coordinated raids on cartel depots. The outcomes were uneven. For every win, there was retaliation. A town burned for a shipment seized, lives lost for each weapon cache captured. When the cycle escalated, the CIA stepped in. Former intelligence officials confirm Langley approved embedding Special Activities Center operatives with Sable North under a protocol of deniable direct action. Translation: they could kill, and if caught, Washington would claim they were contractors, not soldiers. According to a redacted DHS report, 3 of the Tamaulipas dead weren't active-duty soldiers at all, but civilians contracted through a paper company with no real address, ghosts. Yet they wore American patches. Worse, one carried a sat phone linked directly to the National Reconnaissance Office. Gear so sensitive, it's never meant to leave U.S. soil without presidential approval. So here we had unauthorized operatives in foreign territory under U.S. insignia, carrying classified equipment, answering to a chain of command tied to private profits. And when it collapsed, every official, from the White House to the Pentagon to corporate executives now vacationing abroad, lied, pretending it never happened. But the cartels didn't pretend. They gloated. Days later, a video surfaced on a dark web channel, La Fuerza Sombra, showing corpses, wreckage, and the downed silhouette of a U.S. Reaper drone. That's right. They shot one out of the sky. For border agents and troops alike, the message was clear. If you come here, the entire weight of this shadow war falls on you. President Trump boasted he had the strength to wipe cartels off the face of the earth. But the crushing response never came. No retaliatory strikes, no drone swarms, no missile barrages, just silence. Why? Because any retaliation meant admitting what happened, that the U.S. invaded without permission, killed Mexican civilians in preemptive strikes, and was exposed. Now, Mexico is furious. According to diplomatic cables leaked to El País, Mexico has quietly revoked U.S. military flight rights. Intelligence sharing between its Navy Command and U.S. Southcom is strained. Several U.S. consulates have even raised internal threat levels, anticipating revenge attacks. And still, no statement, no televised coffins, no apology. Because an apology would be an admission that the U.S. authorized a hybrid operation of military intelligence and corporate actors that left its own troops dead, all so businessmen could chase energy contracts. You might ask, how do they keep getting away with it? The answer is money. The war on drugs is a trillion-dollar business. Cartels control supply. Washington sells the war on supply. And trapped between? Innocent people, families in Mexican villages, mothers in border towns, soldiers from Texas, Kentucky, Florida, chess pieces on a board the public never chose, never sees, and can never stop. But remember, Tamaulipas was not the origin. This shadow war didn't begin there. Its roots stretch back decades. In 1971, President Richard Nixon stood before the nation and declared, "America's public enemy number one is drug abuse." With that, the so-called war on drugs began. But it wasn't just about drugs, it was about people, communities, dissent. As Nixon aide John Ehrlichman later admitted, the administration knew they couldn't criminalize being anti-war or being black. But by linking hippies to marijuana and black Americans to heroin, they could jail leaders, raid homes, disrupt movements, and vilify them nightly on television. The drug war, in other words, was born in bad faith. Over the decades, as rhetoric escalated, policies hardened. Militarized policing, mandatory minimums, billions funneled into DEA strike units. All while, behind the curtain, the CIA entangled itself in Latin American drug networks. Journalist Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series exposed that CIA operations turned a blind eye, even facilitated cocaine trafficking into U.S. cities to fund Nicaraguan militias. The drug was crack. The destination was black neighborhoods in Los Angeles. The result was mass incarceration on an unprecedented scale. By the late 1980s, Colombian cartels like Medellin and Cali controlled 80% of the global cocaine market, their violence apocalyptic. Assassinations, bombings, mass killings. The U.S. answered with military aid, air surveillance, and training programs. It worked, briefly. Medellin fell. Cali fell. But the void was filled by Mexico. Sinaloa rose, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. As Colombian roots collapsed, Mexican cartels seized control. Within years, Sinaloa, the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, and CJNG transformed Mexico into a narco-state. Under President George W. Bush, the line between the war on terror and the war on drugs blurred. The 2007 Merida Initiative sent billions in weapons, helicopters, and drones to Mexico, but much of it empowered corrupt military factions, fueling cartel militarization. Many Zetas leaders were ex-Mexican commandos trained by the U.S. The very soldiers we taught became the very cartel bosses we later hunted. By 2020, over 100,000 Americans were dying yearly from overdoses. The opioid epidemic was ignited not by cartels, but by pharmaceutical giants like Purdue Pharma, who lied about OxyContin's addictiveness. But cartels seized the crisis, flooding the U.S. with fentanyl so lethal it can kill on contact. And so, by 2025, Trump reignited the war, branding cartels as terrorists, deploying U.S. troops across the border. The result? Tamaulipas. A generation later, nothing has changed. We still invade. We still arm both sides. We still justify endless wars under national security while private contracts lurk behind every mission order. As Sergeant Rourke told investigators, we weren't fighting a war on drugs. We were covering up a war for money. And when we asked why they left us, they said it was national security. But I don't think they meant ours. And even as you hear this, more missions are on the horizon. Whistleblowers say JSOC is preparing incursions in Chihuahua and Sonora. More deniable ops, more profit, more death. Because if this war were truly about saving lives, we wouldn't have spent $1.5 trillion only to see overdose deaths triple. If it were about justice, we wouldn't have jailed black men for marijuana while white billionaires now sell it legally. If it were about security, we wouldn't be launching illegal raids, abandoning our own soldiers to die on foreign soil. The truth? America's longest war has no endgame, because too many are getting rich while others die poor. The war on drugs was never really about drugs. It has always been about power, borders, and profits. Drugs were just the excuse. Thank you for watching today's episode on Empire History Central. Please like and subscribe to stay updated on the hidden truths in history.